Hello, my name is Abigail Johnston, and I have been living with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer since 2017. At the age of 38, I was told I had 12 to 36 months to live. And hearing that as a young person in the middle of my career with 2 young children was devastating. It was also overwhelming. I have chosen to be more aggressive, and I have chosen to have my treatments happen in a certain way because I am always thinking of being present with them. For instance, I closed my practice, my law practice, about a week after my diagnosis because if I was going to have limited time, I wanted to spend all that time possible with my kids, not in the office. I count those times with my kids as so much more valuable, with my husband as well. Living for 15, 20, 25 years with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And that we need to understand why. We need to understand why those people, the people who are able to live for a very long time, is it that particular medicine? Is it a particular biomarker? Is it something about their genetics? That's where precision medicine comes in.
Of course, this audience is for women and patients with metastatic breast cancer. But of course, we have a lot of advancements happening in the curative breast cancer setting. Breast cancer is multiple diseases. It's estrogen receptor positive, it's triple negative, it's HER2 positive. And of course, this audience is for women and patients with metastatic breast cancer. But of course, we have a lot of advancements happening in the curative breast cancer setting. We think about things like screening. We think about things like genetic mutations and the advances there, which I think straddle all types of breast cancer.
I think that there were 3 really important trials that were either initially presented or sort of updates were presented at San Antonio. So the first one is Inavo 120, which is a trial testing PI3 kinase inhibitors in the first line setting. So this is in women who have progressed on adjuvant endocrine therapy, so progressed on your AI, progressed on tamoxifen. And this is thankfully very rare, but we do see it. We do know that there are women who only get 1 or 2 years of mileage out of these therapies, and these therapies just can stop working sometimes. And these are patients for whom there are, this is a hard discussion, right, with patients, because the therapies that we think are supposed to cure you didn't work. They stopped working. So this was a trial that looked at a drug that or a type of drug that we give in the later line setting in breast cancer. This is called a PI3 kinase inhibitor, and this is based on the fact that 40% of breast cancers have mutations in this pathway, mutations in PIK3CA, which is the main sort of engine of this pathway. And so what was interesting about this trial was that they investigated this drug in combination with Ibrance, palbociclib, CDK4/6 inhibitor, and fulvestrant in women who had either progressed on adjuvant endocrine therapy and progressed 1 year within session. So very, very a patient population that has very resistant disease. A couple things really interesting about this trial. First of all, most importantly, this trial, when initially reported, it doubled progression-free survival. And very recently, we actually had a press release that it improved overall survival. We don't know the numbers yet of the overall survival improvement, but this is a big coup in the field. It's the first time that a PI3 kinase pathway inhibitor, I'll explain what I mean by that, has improved overall survival ever.
in metastatic breast cancer. So that is a huge deal in line. And I say ever because we've had drugs like everolimus or Afinitor that target this pathway for decades. But it's only now that we're starting to see really the freaks of that. I think the reason that, why is this overall survival improved now? It's a combination of a couple things. I think, first of all, it's because we're using this drug in the earlier settings, in the first line setting. We're really putting all the weapons into one go and trying to eradicate breast cancer. I think the second is that we as a field have made a lot of progress in monitoring toxicities and making sure that these therapies are have manageable toxicities or toxicities that we can manage as a team. And so I think that was another really important part of this trial, that it was a drug that I think is better tolerated than alpelisib, which is FDA approved. And I think a third reason is the fact that this trial enrolled quite quickly because it used liquid biopsies. So in the past, for a lot of metastatic trials, we as a field have used tissue biopsy, which is obviously more invasive, which takes time as well to biopsy, to analyze, et cetera. This used liquid biopsies in about 93% of patients, and that was pretty remarkable. That is fast. I think also enabled this trial to report results really quickly. So I say, it's interesting. Some of the things I've mentioned in this past couple minutes had to do with the science, but some of them have to do with sort of implementation issues, toxicities, which are science as well, but in a different way. And I think all of these variables really matter. So that's the first trial that was, I think, really practice changing. And this overall survival data, I'm really looking forward to hearing about. The second trial was looking at a drug called an oral SERD. This was the EMBER-3 trial, and this was investigating a drug called imlunestrant, which is a drug that actually it's a pill. It's an oral drug that's sort of an oral version of fulvestrant. It's a pill that degrades the estrogen receptor. And there's already an FDA-approved drug called elacestrant, or Serdu that is approved, and this is for women whose breast cancers have mutations in the estrogen receptor or in a gene called ESR1. Which is a gene called ESR1. And we know that we see these mutations in about 15 to 20% of patients. I would say that number is a little bit all over the place if you look in the literature, because we know that this mutation arises because it is a drug resistance mutation to aromatase inhibitors. So women whose breast cancers progress on adjuvant aromatase inhibitors oftentimes can get this mutation. So this was a drug called imlunestrant that was tested also in combination with Verzenio, or a CDK4/6 inhibitor. And this was a trial that looked at sort of a complicated trial, but the gist is that in women whose breast cancers harbored an ESR1 mutation, those women had a longer progression-free survival if they took imlunestrant versus just a sort of endocrine therapy of physician's choice. So that might be, fulvestrant or an AI monotherapy. So there were some other more complicated arms of the trial where they looked at the combination of imlunestrant and abemaciclib or Verzenio in patients who had progressed on CDK4/6 inhibitors in the second line. And those were positive data. They did improve progression-free survival. The comparator arms were not necessarily what we would use in the second line setting. So what I mean by that is that any average patient who is in that second line setting, we would obtain their genomics, we would figure out the exact targeted therapy, and then we would give them that therapy. This trial did not really test that particular question. It did show that this combination has efficacy, but I think it's hard to understand who is the right patient population. And I do look forward to seeing how the FDA weighs in on the combination. But I do anticipate that imlunestrant as a monotherapy is going to be a drug that we see being approved. I will say that I was impressed by the imlunestrant side effect data. I think that's where, if this drug gets approved, I do think it will. I think it will be the preferred drug compared to elacestrant. And the reason I say that is not because of the efficacy data. I think the efficacy data were pretty similar across both trials. It's more that the toxicities. Elacestrant is a drug, we give it in the clinic. It has, the nausea is very, very real in these patients. And I think imlunestrant, I was impressed that it looks just like a cleaner drug. That being said, all of these drugs, we don't really know how they work until they get deployed in the immediate line. And that's where a lot of you all are very helpful, because you can raise awareness for certain types of symptoms that we either know about, or certain symptoms that may not get a lot of publicity, but then in later years we find out, oh my goodness, this is actually a big deal.
one example of that side effect is, inflammation of the lungs from CDK4/6 inhibitors. That was something that didn't really bear out in the phase 3 clinical trials, but it was patient advocates who noticed these symptoms and oncologists who sort of noticed these symptoms in small numbers. And then the FDA did a big analysis where they pooled all of this data together and they found out, this is actually the safety signal. So this is where you all can be very helpful as these drugs get newly launched into the real world to help us figure out what are the toxicities. The third trial that I wanted to talk about was Patina. So this, I think, is a really exciting trial and speaks to the what you talked about earlier, Abigail, about just the sort of fast-moving pace of this field. This is a trial that has actually not been published yet. And this is really amazing, groundbreaking, stuff. Again, the science is one part of it, but the dissemination of the information is another very important part of it. And again, I think that's where you as patients can really advocate. You want these answers, you want these data as soon as possible. I say this because oncologists have already started to implement these results into clinical practice before the paper has been published. And so this was a trial looking at women with HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer that is also ER positive. So HER2 positive breast cancer is about 20% of breast cancer, and about 80% of that 20% or 70%, so let's say like 14% total, is estrogen receptor positive, HER2 positive. We sometimes call this triple positive, ER positive, PR positive, HER2 positive. And we generally treat these cancers as we treat the HER2 sort of component of this, and then we just tack on a bunch of hormonal therapies in the adjuvant setting and in the metastatic setting as well. And so what this trial did was investigate the addition of CDK4/6 inhibitors, which we know improve overall survival in estrogen receptor positive, HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer. Well, what about testing it in estrogen receptor positive, HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer? So it's a little more complicated here because the therapy that we give is a combination of chemotherapy, Taxol, or docetaxel, with anti-HER2 antibodies, Herceptin and Perjeta, trastuzumab and pertuzumab. That's this THP regimen. It's the Cleopatra trial. This has been our standard of care for many, many years now. Improves overall survival. It's the best combination we have in this disease. So what they did is that they gave the THP therapy. And normally what we do is we give the chemotherapy for 6 cycles, we stop the chemotherapy, and then patients are just on their Herceptin and Perjeta. And that's like a great moment, I think, in any patient's disease trajectory and treatment trajectory, because once the chemo is off, the HP is, for the vast majority of patients, very few to no symptoms. Patients will tell me it's like getting water. And again, not to minimize anyone who's had symptoms from these drugs, but in large populations, very, very well tolerated. So what they did is at that point where we would normally drop the chemo, we would oftentimes add the hormone therapy in these patients who are ER positive. So then also adding a CDK4/6 inhibitor, adding Ibrance or palbociclib. And they found that in those patients, when they did that versus without adding the Ibrance, the progression-free survival improvement was just gigantic. It went from 29 months to 44 months. So that is a 12-month, 13-month improvement. And I think that one chestnut about this data that I think, if anything, makes this like underappreciated or underrated is the fact that delta, we talk about the delta a lot, just meaning the change between the therapy arms. What's the delta? Obviously, you want a big delta, right? That shows your therapy works. That delta of 12 months is actually higher than the delta in progression-free survival in ER-positive metastatic breast cancer, meaning that the addition of the CDK4/6 inhibitor is actually sort of by these data, maybe even doing more than what we thought it was doing in ER-positive HER2 negative breast cancer, where CDK4/6 inhibitors, of course, transformed the landscape. So this is really exciting from a therapy point of view. I hope with all my heart that this results in an overall survival improvement. We still need to see. But this is really exciting. And I think the data blew everyone out of the water when the progression-free survival curves were shown. There were actually audible gasps in the audience. That is amazing. I put my hand on my heart. That is incredible. We don't get moments like that a lot. And that's really wonderful. And so I'm really excited about these data. So this is a really interesting area to start putting in some of these targeted therapies that we only give in ER-positive breast cancer into the ER-positive, HER2-positive space. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more trials that are doing this sort of paradigm. So that's something I think for patients in the audience who may have ER positive, HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer, this is going to be a very fast moving area now. And I think we're going to see a lot of trials by many companies and even cooperative groups combining all of these therapies. Again, the proof, there's still a lot of complexity because, you can imagine here, this is now going from 3 drugs to sort of 4 drugs, right? Or 5 drugs. And we have to think about toxicities and toxicity management here. But this is really, I think, incredible data. I was floored when I saw this because I was not expecting it as well. And again, that's really wonderful for all of you.
So in that context, we know this information, but nothing's been published yet. Is that correct?
Nothing's been published yet. I think that many of us now have already started to change our practice, change our recommendations based on this. This is a conversation, of course, with patients, knowing that the data, we have this initial glimpse into the data. We don't have all the answers right now. We all obviously hope that insurance companies and advocate, oncologists will advocate. This is such an amazing improvement that, your oncologist will advocate for you to try to get this and work their hardest to get this drug if this applies for you. But again, speaks to the fast moving nature of this field and how it's so imperative that we get these results out as soon as we can for everyone in the community.
Thank you for that overview. It can be a little complicated as patients to look at these statistical analyses and graphs, and some of it is a little Greek to those of us who are not, don't have that background. So it's always good to have a doctor to be able to interpret those things, but also important to see the evolution of science, right? That we know what we know today, but we're going to know more tomorrow because of clinical trials and because of this ongoing research. So you mentioned ADCs, and certainly there was some conversations about antibody drug conjugates and sequencing.
Antibody drug conjugates have really changed the landscape in the treatment of breast cancer. We now have antibody drug conjugates that are approved in all 3 subtypes of breast cancer. HER2 positive, that was TDX, well, actually many years ago, TDM1, TDXD in HER2 positive breast cancer, in triple negative breast cancer, sacituzumab, and of course HER2 low, which was sort of our triple negative / ER positive, but HER2 low, TDXD, and then sacituzumab in ER positive metastatic breast cancer. That was a couple years ago. And then now Dato-DXd, which is sort of a sacituzumab-like drug, similar target in ER positive metastatic breast cancer. I will say, and this is my opinion, it's always good to have options on the table, and I applaud the FDA. I think that having options is good. I will say that as an oncologist, it's hard for me to imagine, given the data that been shown so far, it's hard for me to imagine for estrogen receptor positive metastatic breast cancer recommending Dato-DXd over sacituzumab based on all the data that I've seen so far, and this is my opinion. But it is an option, and it may be the option that is best for you. It'll be really interesting to see if this drug, how its progress in other breast cancer subtypes, in triple negative breast cancer. It's being investigated in lung cancer as well. So ADCs are really here to stay. I think they've really changed how we think about drugs and targets. I think about it like I think it's a next generation chemotherapy. That's sort of how I think about it. And that's how I communicate it with patients as well. I think that's a helpful metaphor from my point of view for a couple reasons. Number one, these drugs have side effects that are more similar to chemotherapy. They're more muted, I would argue, but they are similar, and they're similar in genre. They can cause hair loss. They can cause diarrhea. They can cause neuropathy. These are side effects we associate with chemotherapy. Generally, they're less than what we see with chemotherapy. These drugs are also given, once they have cycles, right? Sort of in the same lingo and parlance with chemo. You have to cycle, you wait 3 weeks, you get your next round. So I think for that purpose, it's a helpful metaphor. And in the trials that are testing these drugs, they're always comparing it to chemotherapy of physician's choice. So it's always sort of a head-to-head versus chemo. I say that because, again, fast-moving field. We're now seeing TDXD moving earlier into, the adjuvant setting, the neoadjuvant setting, and earlier in the ER-positive metastatic breast cancer space. And I think that right now, there was an approval for HER2 ultra low, but it's moving up, and it's very likely that we're going to have a world soon where in the second line setting, maybe to Abigail's point earlier, these patients who the Inavo 120 regimen, if it stops working for those patients, we may be talking about ADCs even in the second line for those patients. Now, I think that, this would be patients who are fit, are able to tolerate these therapies. That's a different discussion, but we're going to, I think that's where the puck is heading, is really into the second line. And it's going to be an option. It's not an option for everyone, but it will be an option. So I think that ADCs are changing the game because they're changing the way we think about toxicity and efficacy, and they're moving up. And again, more options I think is always better for patients, but it's going to be a complicated lens.
You've talked about toxicities, and I think that's mostly in the context of side effects. You mentioned a few, but what about the time toxicity, and how do you talk about that with your patients, right? So the difference between taking an oral therapy at home versus having to go to the infusion center every 3 weeks, say, for an ADC.
So this is a great question, and also I think is fast moving in a couple ways. So one thing I will say is, in the HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer space, we have, there's been a lot of emphasis and research on both subcutaneous formulations. So Phesgo is the drug I'm thinking of, which is HP, but given in a shot, like in the fat. And also biosimilars, which I bring up because I think that is a relevant part of the conversation. It gets to costs and now virtually all of the Herceptin and Perjeta, or sorry, I should say trastuzumab and pertuzumab that we're giving in big academic centers, most of the time it is biosimilars now because they're generic drugs, they're cheaper, this is better for the system. But I do think that this sort of emphasis on, drug gets approved, it becomes generic, but let's come up with new formulations is a very relevant conversation. I will say that, and this is where I think your input is very helpful as patient advocates and patients, is that, there may be a world in the near future, the distant future, where patients might, even with metastatic disease, might be taking these drugs at home. I do think that is a possibility. I will say that during COVID, when coming into the infusion center was risky for so many of our patients, those were options that were deployed in trials or in sort of feasibility studies. So we know it's possible, feasible, safe, all these things. So I say this because this is, again, I think an area where the puck is moving. Can we come up with better models of how to get drugs to patients ultimately? I will say that this concept of, coming in every 3 weeks versus taking a drug every day, there are, I think, pros and cons of both. I think that obviously a pro about taking an oral pill is that it's in your control as a patient. You're taking the medication. It doesn't necessarily mean that the drug is less toxic. I would argue we have plenty of drugs that are oral that are more toxic, frankly, than certain IV chemotherapies. It's apples and oranges. But there are formulations, and I think that the field is moving towards areas, and this is where oral SERDs are really interesting drugs, because we give fulvestrant, which we know, and all, many patients, of course, tell us, no one wants to get shots in the buttock like every month. No one wants that, right? And so it is interesting that the oral SERDs have come along. I would argue that we thought as a field that these oral SERDs were going to basically replace fulvestrant. That's not what we're seeing, because they only seem to have the activity in the patients whose breast cancers have ESR1 mutations. That's a small piece of the pie. I think with every sort of conversation around how to change these formulations, you have to reinvestigate these questions, because some of our assumptions turn out to be wrong. But this is a really important change in the field. And I would even go a step further. I think breast cancer has led this in oncology, because now we're starting to see sub-Q formulations of other antibodies. And these are the sorts of things where I think as patients to be really savvy and know everything about what's going on. If that's something that gives you solace, if that's something that lessens your anxiety, these are all questions to ask your oncologist. Everything that Abigail just said, what are all the drugs available to me? What are the targeted therapies, antibody drug conjugates, chemotherapies, antibody therapies, clinical trials? Which of these drugs are IV? Can we give this in a way that makes more sense for my life? These are all really important questions that you all should feel empowered to ask, because we do have answers.
Thank you for bringing up the quality of life type discussions, right? And how important that is to have with your doctor. There was some data that came out at San Antonio about obesity, which is always a sensitive subject or something maybe a little more complicated to talk about. How are you having that conversation with your patients, Dr. Basson?
We're always interested in trying to find, are there modifiable risk factors that can decrease risk for cancer? We know that, and this was, the Surgeon General in the 1980s, I believe, the warnings on cigarette packs and things like this, of course, have decreased the rates of lung cancer, and the smoking rates are much lower now than they were 20 years ago. But are there other modifiable risk factors that can, that can decrease the risk of breast cancer? So, I mentioned obesity in line with alcohol because those two things are a little linked. And the only thing I wanted to say is that it's interesting. The National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine, called NASEM, NASEM, released a sort of concurrent report that actually argues that if obesity, well, I'll choose my words carefully here, but if obesity is that confounding variable of obesity is removed from the alcohol analysis, if you will. So basically trying to understand if you take alcohol, but without sort of combining the obesity question, if you just look at alcohol in the absence of obesity, it turns out that actually the risk of breast cancer is actually a lot lower than we thought. It's 1% over someone's lifetime. That's the absolute increase in risk. The relative risk, of course, is higher. Getting into a little bit of the statistics, academic discussion. But the bottom line is, that's a hard discussion. A 1% increase in absolute risk. How are you really going to decrease that by, alcohol cessation, which can be really hard and complicated for people. So I say that I just put that out there. I think obesity, though, we do know that estrogen receptor positive breast cancer is a known or that obesity is a known risk factor of ER positive breast cancer, less so for other breast cancer subtypes. And this is something that I think the way that I talk about it with patients is, we know that this is a modifiable risk factor. Let's get through, if you're on some sort of active therapy, we'll put it out on the table. Let's talk about this issue, but let's not intervene on that until you're done with the hardest parts of this therapy. This is something that comes up all the time in the adjuvant setting. Women who want to lose weight, it's natural, right? You get ambushed with breast cancer and you want to investigate all the avenues of your life. How can, I do better, or how can I change things? And so I always say to patients, and this is just my opinion, let's get through the hardest part. Let's get through your chemotherapy. Let's get through your surgery first. Then let's talk about these issues. I will say that we are starting to see now lots of changes, right, in the medication world, Ozempic, Mounjaros of the world. There's actually a lot of really interesting work even being done on looking at these drugs and their anti-cancer effects. So this is anti-cancer effects irrespective of their effects on diet and weight loss. And that's fascinating as well. So I think that this is a fast moving space. What I recommend to patients is, when we're talking about weight loss is to, talk about the real specifics of an exercise regime and talk about food intake. And I think that these are great conversations that are being had in your doctor's office. I think this is also something we're seeing at the national level, even politically. We're seeing a lot more discussion about lifestyle and changes that can be made. I do think there's a lot more awareness now, even in the last couple of years, about what we're putting into our body, what we're putting into our kids' bodies. And I will just say, I think the big question is trying to understand, if we make a change, does that really change your risk of breast cancer? Does that improve your survival with metastatic breast cancer? And these are all questions that we're really hoping to find answers to. They're very hard studies to design. Certainly, weight loss is going to help anyone, myself included, with all aspects of life, cardiovascular disease, or cardiovascular risk factors, et cetera. It's going to help with a lot of things. But I think the question is always, I don't want someone to become a vegetarian overnight if that's a pretty drastic change. Trying to understand, well, what's that really going to give you at the end of the day? So these are all important conversations to have. But I do think we're going to start to see more research done in this area.
But just so important for patients to remember that this isn't about patient shaming. It isn't about saying that they're responsible for anything, but about looking at how to improve quality of life while reducing risk at the same time. You were part of a discussion. It was a case-based clinical approach to ER-positive metastatic breast cancer, that one of your presentations at San Antonio. Would you like to talk about that?
So, again, fast moving ER positive metastatic breast cancer, fast moving field, lots of new therapies approved in the last year, last 2 years, things new in the pipeline. And we get into a lot of clinical scenarios. And I would say this is very common. It's not like some rare zebra. This happens all the time in clinic. Patients who have multiple alterations that we have targetable drugs for, patients who have unusual comorbidities, heart disease, had a transplant, things like this. These are scenarios we see all the time. And then trying to really understand what is the best drug right at this moment for this patient that's going to help them live the longest and also have the best quality of life. So this was a really great discussion. And I will say it was really wonderful to have a patient advocate on the panel. I think this is really important because a lot of these drugs have side effects that mean different things to different people. I'll give you one example. This is sort of my maybe soapbox, if you will. I talk about this a lot, like side effects mean different things to different people. They also mean different things, I would argue, for oncologists compared to patients. The way that we grade side effects and rate side effects, if you will, can mean a lot of different things. Grade 3 diarrhea is like 10 episodes a day. I mean, that's insane. That's crazy. And, so grade 3 is usually the red flag, but like grade 1 and grade 2, that's a lot of diarrhea, right? Like that's a lot. Stomatitis is something I think about a lot. It's a side effect that we're starting to see more now with AKT inhibitors. There were less than 10%, but some reasonable percent of women who had grade 3 stomatitis, which is inflammation of the mouth. Grade 3 means the stomatitis is so bad that you're losing weight. It's not like grade 1 is that's there and grade 2 is painful. Like those are big side effects, right? And so you could argue a grade 3 side effect X might be very different from grade 1 side effect Y if Y is really, really bad. So I just say this because the toxicities and the communication of the toxicities is so important to that everyone is on the same page. And if you're having some side effect that you feel like is not getting the time that you think you need to talk about it, you need to talk about it, right? If you're having a lot of diarrhea, if you're having a lot of neuropathy, if it's in a weird distribution in your body, if something doesn't feel right. I always tell my patients, if something doesn't feel right, I want to hear from you. I'd rather hear from you than not hear from you, And so I think these are really important discussions.
So what about patients will talk about their fear that if they bring up a side effect that they're struggling with, that will end up meaning they can't stay on the medication. And so how do you handle that in the clinic?
Yeah, I always try to make it clear that we have a lot of doses that we can give of drugs. They're generally for targeted therapies 3 doses. That's not gospel truth, but we have multiple options. And I do think one of the biggest challenges is trying to communicate that there is no one optimal dose and that different patients, for whatever reason we don't understand, some doses are just much better tolerated than others. Certain doses for certain individuals are that perfect Goldilocks, perfect range. And I say that, I'll give a couple examples of that, but I say that because it's very hard to understand. It's hard to sort of accept that if your doctor recommends a dose reduction, to not equate that with I'm not being like as hard enough on myself, or I'm not being as strong. And because I always tell patients, like, I don't want you to feel the side effects of the therapy. Like that, the goal is to like not have any side effects and it's working on the scans. It's not to like feel it in your bones or feel it physically, somatically, that's not what this is about. And so I do think that is hard. And I will say that, if I were a patient, I could understand feeling like less than if my doctor said you need a lower dose. So I get that, but I want patients to understand that there's been so much rigorous analysis for every one of these drugs that's FDA approved, looking at those lower dose levels, trying to understand if you lower the dose, like, are you really attenuating, are you decreasing the benefits of the survival, response rate, et cetera? And the answer, like, for the vast, vast majority is no, you're not. And so I think that's so important for patients to understand. I want patients to know that doctors are always thinking about this, but that's like a perfect example where, it's actually baked into the how we give the drug. CDK4/6 inhibitors, we give 3 weeks on, 1 week off. All of that is sort of a dose reduction. It's not dose reduction per se, it's dose intensity, but it's the same idea. And I just think it's really important for people to know that if your doctor recommends a lower dose, it's not because of anything you did or did not do. It's just because that dose is just the right dose for you. There are a lot of people doing research into what's called pharmacogenomics. Are there aspects about different races that may change the way that you metabolize drugs? And so it's been known for a very long time that Asians have certain metabolic enzymes that change the way their bodies process capecitabine or Zolota. And so that's something that in the GI cancer field and in certain types of GI cancers like stomach cancer that are very prevalent in Asian countries, China, Japan, that these are really important parts of the conversation. And so I just say that because there are biological reasons why that we may not know yet that could explain why this dose is just not the right dose.
And yet another reason why diversity in clinical trials is so important, because if we don't have enough of each people group, we're not going to necessarily know if something is specific to that people group. So thank you for raising that. In the time that we have left, I would really love for you to talk about what you are looking forward to next. What is new and exciting that you're looking forward to?
I'm very excited about the 3 trials that I talked about earlier. I'll just go, I think in HER2 positive, I think TDXD is obviously it's already changed the world. I think there's still many more scenarios that I think TDXD will find an approval and will find a role in. Moving these drugs into the neoadjuvant adjuvant setting, I think is always wonderful when we see that. And I think that that's going to be where that field heads. Like I said before, the Patina trial, where we're starting to integrate targeted therapies into that complicated regimen, I think is going to be a really interesting move that field heads into. I think that in estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, there's still a lot more interesting targets that are being investigated in phase 1 trials. One target I have my eye on is something called KAT6A. It's a epigenetic target. It's the idea that your DNA can get modified by lots of different ways, and the proteins that modify that DNA, they're called epigenetic proteins, writers, erasers. There's lots of different classes, and one of those is this protein called KAT6A. It's going through clinical trials right now. The response rates are very high for patients who have progressed on lots of different therapies. There's also a lot of toxicities as well. So those are things that will have to be managed. In the PI3 kinase space, mutant selective PI3 kinase inhibitors, these are really exciting drugs. They seem to have little to no hyperglycemia. They are mutant selective, so they're only targeting they're ultra targeted in a way. They're only targeting the mutated PI3 kinase in cancer cells and not targeting the normal PI3 kinase in all the other cells in your body, like the liver and fat cells that can cause all these bad side effects. So really exciting. And then in triple negative breast cancer, it's still the hardest disease. And, I do want people to know that I do think that there are some interesting advances being made in optimizing chemotherapies with immune therapy. I don't think we've quite cracked that yet in the field. There's always work being done with BRCA and with trying to find the patients who really benefit from those therapies. It's still the hardest area, though. I do think ADCs is really where ADCs, I think, are going to find a huge traction in TNBC, as they already have. As an example, sacituzumab, it is a better drug in triple negative breast cancer than it is in ER positive breast cancer, just to give that comparison. So I do think that there's still more to be seen there. So I'm always, I love talking to people who know a lot about breast cancer and people who are maybe outside the field, because it's such a fast moving field. It's a privilege to take care of patients who have breast cancer and to be able to sort of talk about all these therapies and really communicate. I hope you can tell I'm excited about when I talk about this. It's such an amazing field, because everyone is so united and mission oriented to just keep moving fast in it.
And let's talk about PIK3CA Pathbreakers. It is a patient advocacy group, and would love for you to talk about it.
Yeah, so we were inspired by you and I and others were inspired by the lung cancer patient advocacy group. So lung cancer, EGFR, and there have been targeted therapies for decades now against a slew of genes that are mutated in cancer, in lung cancer. And there have been these incredible groups that have formed around the target. EGFR resistors is one of them. And these are amazing groups that have, I think, changed the world. They have changed patient advocacy. They have seats at the table. They change how oncologists think about designing trials. The people on these organizations have seats at the table with pharma companies as they design their trials, with regulatory agencies as they're approving these drugs. It's really incredible. And actually, breast cancer, because we have not necessarily had a genomically directed targeted therapy, i.e. a gene that's mutated that we find on a sequencing report, until PI3 kinase, we have, I think that that's something that's lacking in the field. We have formed this organization called PIK3CA Pathbreakers. We're a patient advocacy group formed around patients with PIK3CA altered breast cancers. And we're really invested in trying to increase awareness around clinical trials in this space, increase knowledge about side effects that is really sort of side effect articulated through the lens of patients, but articulated by oncologists, and trying to really make sure we're having strategies that can mitigate these side effects. And then one area that I didn't get a huge chance to talk about today is really the education and landscape around next generation sequencing. This is something that has changed dramatically in the last 2 years. When to get sequencing, first line, later lines, what to get sequencing on, tissue, liquid, how often to get sequencing, one time, or do we keep getting it? These are areas that are very fast moving. These are areas that I think we're still trying to make sure that insurance companies are approving these drugs. And I do think that these are bigger conversations that we have to have at a national level. But that's another big area. And then, of course, what are the mutations? PIK3CA, there are thousands of mutations that are seen in patients. Of course, some are very common, but we get questions all the time about these rare mutations. Do these rare mutations predict for response to these drugs? We don't know. And I will say, as an oncologist and someone who specializes in PI3 kinase, I get emails all the time from oncologists all over the country. They see this rare mutation. Does this predict response for TrueCap or pipivasertib? We don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Basson, for your time and your insights and your excitement. It's always good as a patient to see that there are doctors, researchers, clinicians as invested in our care as we think everybody should be. So very much appreciated. And so, certainly this video series, The Patient Story, has a YouTube channel that has all these videos, which is wonderful.
As soon as I get to the gym, I get a phone call from my doctor that the mass was cancerous.
I was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 31 years old. That means I'm 14 years around in fighting with cancer.
Dr. Basson, where do you point patients to get more information?
Every patient is so different, and sometimes you find something online that's just not right or not relevant. And I say this because sometimes I've heard things from patients like, oh, I saw this, and it's like, well, that's not really relevant for you for X, Y, and Z reasons. And it might be something we talk about. It might be something I'm telling you now, this is why it's not relevant. So there can be a lot of information that it's just hard to know how to interpret the data. And I guess one more thing I will say is, because, again, breast cancer is such a fast moving field, of course, when anyone gets diagnosed, they're going to talk to family members. I will say that I find that more often than not, how breast cancer was treated in your loved one, like 5 years ago, might be like radically different. It might not even be an option we're talking about now, because there are newer and better things. So even it doesn't mean you should talk to everyone in your life, but like you're going to get a lot of information, and sometimes it's discordant. And so I think the NCCN is a great place to start. I think that a lot of the LBBC, a lot of a great MBC Alliance, there are a lot of great, all of the documents I've seen on all those websites are obviously spot on. I think those are great places to start. Wikipedia is not a great place to start. Twitter is not a great place to start. But that being said, and, as Abigail mentioned, Twitter is a great place to find your tribe, right? To find your network, to link with people. I would highly encourage people to reach out on Twitter. I've been really humbled and sort of awed by the groundswell in patient advocacy. Facebook, the PIK3CA Pathbreakers has a huge Facebook group, as does all of the other patient advocacy groups. So find your tribe through there and get anecdotes, get your stories from all of those people. But be judicious about what information you take in about your own cancer, or at least don't necessarily extrapolate like everything you hear to your own.
So I think the most important thing that patients who are living with breast cancer and their loved ones is that there's no one right way to do it. That you as an individual person, looking for the ways that make you comfortable, that make you able to handle, that make you able to put cancer into your life, not your life into cancer. That is the right way for you to do living with cancer.